Hi, I'm Jeff Gonzalez, president of Trident Concepts, and I'm here with Brownells Daily Defense to talk to you about trigger errors from our shooter's diagnostics perspective. So, one of the other corrective strategies that we'll work on is going to have to do with trigger errors. And I'll be honest, the majority of shooter errors that we see are going to be related to trigger. So, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start with the shooter making sure that they are applying correct technique. And as we go through this process, we're going to start to eliminate variables that will hopefully ultimately lead us to what the shooter is actually doing wrong. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on trigger finger placement. So if I see a shooter with some shooting errors and they look to be trigger related, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking to them about, well, what part of your trigger finger are you putting on the finger? I'm sorry, on the trigger. And they'll start to think, I'm not really sure. Well, problem number one, we need to focus on exactly the precise position of our trigger finger in order to make sure that we are applying pressure correctly. So we'll do a couple strings of fire. Maybe I don't see the error corrected. Maybe I see the error corrected. We see the error corrected, awesome, we move on. If we don't see the error corrected, then the next thing we're going to talk about is the finger's location on the trigger itself. So that means that what part of the trigger are they actually placing their finger? And again, they may say to me, well, I'm not entirely sure, in which case I'll direct them to focus more on where their finger is placed. Then the next shooting string, they can come back and say, oh, you know what, Jeff? I feel like I was more at the top or maybe in the middle. And I'll be like, all right, well, that's okay. But what we want to do is we want to move our finger to the lower portion of the trigger to generate more leverage, more power. So maybe that corrects the error, maybe that doesn't. So the next thing we'll do is we'll start to look at the trigger's movement. And as I'm looking at the target, in specific, what am I looking for? Well, I'm looking to see where are those shots being placed. The first thing I want to hopefully do is eliminate a complex shooting error. I want to break it down into just a simple shooting error. And if I see that simple shooting error, it's generally going to be at about the 6 o'clock region, maybe 5 to 7 at times, but generally it's going to be right there at that 6 o'clock region. And typically when I see that that shot group at 6 o'clock, how low at 6 o'clock is going to tell me typically what type of shooting error that is. If I see it just barely at the bottom of the aim point, a lot of times what that is that's just a little bit of what we call a stall point. So as the shooter is applying that 3-2-1, they kind of stall at that one position. And again, this can have a lot to do with not having enough power to move smoothly all the way through. But if we see that that shot group is actually kind of low, typically I know what's happening, which is that they're going from 3 to 1, they're skipping 2 altogether, applying too much force, and the gun is moving before it actually fires. So what do we try to do? We try to isolate the trigger fingers to make sure that it's not doing anything it shouldn't be doing. That means that it's not rubbing the frame, that means it's correctly placed, that means it's got all the correct movement patterns repeated so that it's doing everything that it needs to do. And when we see those errors, we can start to work with the shooter to correct them. Now, the last thing that we typically will see that could potentially be a trigger-related error is actually the grip. And this doesn't sound like it should happen, but when we see a shooter error in a certain position, a lot of times what that means is that it's a grip integrity issue. And a lot of times what I'll have to do is I'll have to remind the shooter, make sure that you're squeezing really hard with both hands, because when they are trying to be so precise with one hand, they relax that grip. But they didn't relax the other hand, and so that other hand pulls the shot group over to the side. All right, so I'll create a shooting error right here. We'll kind of go through that diagnostic process, see what it looks like. All right. All right, so I have the shooter shoot a shot group. I try to get about 3 to 5 rounds in that shot group because it helps me to really to evaluate whether the shooter has consistency, repeatability. So in this case, I'll ask the shooter, all right, I see your shot group is mainly at a 9 o'clock position. And we go through the standard litany of questions about, are they doing this? Are they doing that? Typically when I see this, it's going to be boiled down into one of 2 errors. The first error is, do you feel your finger rubbing up against the frame? If you feel your finger rubbing up against the frame, it's going to push those shots directly to that 9 o'clock position. And then I'll ask the shooter, if you feel your finger rubbing up against the frame, before you start pulling the trigger, let's adjust your finger's placement. Make sure that it's isolated away from any other part of the frame. If that doesn't seem to be the problem, if that didn't correct the issue, then the next thing we talk about is that grip integrity. And a lot of times the shooter doesn't realize that they're relaxing that grip. And as soon as I can get them to focus in on that grip, all of a sudden their shooting error changes. So a lot of times, how do I get them to focus on that grip? Well, I remove the weak hand from the variable. So if they are creating that shooting error because their left hand, weak hand is overpowering the right, by taking this out, it forces them to actually shoot with just one hand. Now, if I see the shooting error still at that 9 o'clock position, I know that it's a trigger-related issue. But if that shooting error corrected and is now centered up, I know now that that was a grip-related issue. So when we put both hands back on the gun, we have to really reinforce, squeeze in equally with both hands. All right, next time you're out at the range, play with these corrective strategies, see what you're doing, see if you can start diagnosing what's happening. And if you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them down below. Until then, I'm Jeff Gonzalez. Take care and stay safe.